Hi there. I hope you've been having a good week. Now, before we go into the first 4 chapters of Wright's book, so part 1, let's review. Our module thesis this time around is as follows. Wright seeks to address significant confusion concerning Jesus' resurrection and ascension. In order to clarify that thesis in this video, you're going to make 4 interpretive moves. First, after establishing some basic context for Wright, you're going to survey his argument about postmodern humanity's confusion in terms of the afterlife. Second, you're going to review his claims about relatively recent Christian confusion in churches concerning the resurrection. Third, you're going to assess his contentions about the historical setting of Christian hope in the resurrection. Fourth and finally, you're going to evaluate his claims about what precisely happened on that first Easter when Jesus rose. Let's begin with very basic context on Wright, as I say. You can see him pictured there. Nicholas Thomas Wright, called N.T. Wright or Tom Wright, depending on who you talk to, is an English New Testament scholar, a Pauline historian, that is a historian in terms of St. Paul's writings, and a retired bishop of the Church of England. He was Bishop of Durham. Currently, Dr. Wright holds the position of Research Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at St. Mary's College in the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Wright's work is highly regarded by church leaders and historians and theologians in general, although it's worth noting here that Wright has numerous critics of diverse theological stripes. Carrying on to our first goal for the lecture, in the introductory chapter to Surprised by Hope, Wright offers his readers 5 snapshots that outline the contours of the 2 questions that his book sets out to answer. The 2 questions are at the bottom of the slide, the 5 snapshots at the top. I'm not sure that Wright recalled that single books are only supposed to answer single questions, but that's all right. I digress. Wright touches first on the sentimentality evoked by the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, and then goes on to the comments of an English football coach, Glenn Hoddle, concerning resurrection, rather reincarnation. He also talks about the scene of a cremation, the devastation evoked in New York City on September 11th of 2001, and what he calls the post-industrial blight of places like Easington Colliery in County Durham in England. Wright makes note of these scenes because all of them provide him and his readers with a different vision of the afterlife. In light of those scenes, as you can see, Wright asks, first, what is the ultimate Christian hope? Second, what hope is there for change, rescue, transformation, and new possibility within the world in the present? So, Wright is theorizing that a totally spiritual afterlife divorced from the earthly world separates the 2 questions from each other. By contrast, a vision of Christian hope centered on God's new creation and based firmly in Jesus' resurrection will not only join the 2 questions together, but help the first to answer the second. I have numerous struggles with Wright's logic, as you'll see throughout this text, but I endorse his conclusions. Jesus' resurrection offers people great hope for social transformation and allows us to celebrate the world's beauty and joy in the face of sin and death. Now, after setting the scene with his 5 thumbnail sketches, Wright claims that, quote, most people, including most practicing Christians, are muddled and misguided on the topic of life after death, and this muddle produces serious mistakes in our thinking, praying, liturgies, practice, and perhaps particularly our mission to the world. Now, this is the first point at which I would caution you about Wright's logic. He's correct to point out that people are unclear in their thinking about life after death, but he also uses the word mistake when he talks about that, a word that he derives from his own conviction in his rightness. So in any work that you do, ministerial or otherwise, beware of telling people that their convictions are mistaken without attempting to engage their reasoning, as Wright does here. The rest of the very brief chapter addresses the shapes and sorts and sizes of belief in an afterlife according to Wright. It ranges from Muslim belief in paradise to Hindu belief in reincarnation, and including African and Japanese ancestor worship, as well as the steep decline in belief in hell after the First World War. Wright categorizes these many different kinds of belief into three types: a belief in complete annihilation, what he calls a sort of low-grade popular nature religion with elements of Buddhism, and a belief in ghosts and communion with the dead. You can see a picture of the Buddhist kind of thing on the slide. If that's what we're going for, sign me up. But we can observe that Frisk's eschatology would likely help out Wright here in his confusion because the two of them seem allied on many important fronts. So let's go on to our second goal, looking at Wright's assertions about the current confusion in Christian churches about resurrection. After reviewing a poetic and pious sermon preached by one Henry Scott Holland on the occasion of the death of the English King Edward II in 1910, Wright clearly and brilliantly interprets John Donne's holy sonnet, "Death be not proud." Let's read it together to get the context. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou think'st thou doth overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones, and soul's delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppy or charms canst make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Why swell'st thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death thou shalt die. So, in terms of the sonnet, Wright observes that, quote, in line with much classical Christian thought, Donne sees life after death in two stages. First, a short sleep, then an eternal waking. Death will not simply be redefined, but defeated. He also points out that many Western churches see death in a similar light. Having said all that, Wright goes on to argue that the language of the New Testament forbids a picture of death wherein we go to heaven when we die, a picture he claims is promoted by still other Western Christian churches. Rather, the New Testament's language offers a clear picture of God's sovereign rule coming on earth, as it is in heaven, Wright's words. Wright claims that the afterlife is, quote, not a future destiny, but the other hidden dimension of our ordinary life, end quote. After he tackles, with varied degrees of success or failure, several Christian hymns that he claims promulgate a spiritualized version of resurrection or afterlife, Wright argues that the classical Christian doctrine provides a much more robust spirituality than any Platonic dogma. He says, it was people who believed robustly in the resurrection who stood up against Caesar in the first centuries of the Christian era. I affirm that, but that's likely enough for the second chapter for now. Third, following a necessary clarification about the content of the rest of the book, Wright dwells on what he calls the historical setting of Christian hope, and addresses what sort of event took place on the Easter morning when Jesus was raised. This, dear class, is where Wright returns to his elements. I find the first two chapters of Surprised by Hope awfully confusing, but the third is good. I recognize that Wright's strength is his interpretation of the biblical text, even though he intersperses self-referential footnotes throughout that interpretation. Wright asks both what the ancient Greco-Roman and Jewish world believed about life after death, and how the Christian hope promised in the stories of resurrection in the Gospels changed that Jewish hope into something deeply radical. So, 3A is what Greco-Roman and Jewish folks believed in terms of life after death. Wright asserts that ancient pagans didn't believe in an afterlife at all. He states, death was all-powerful. One could neither escape it in the first place, nor break its power once it had come. Most people didn't believe in resurrection either, at least not in the stringent way that Wright proposes. Then Wright claims that some Jewish authorities, like the Sadducees, denied resurrection, They agreed with pagans who denied it. And some Jewish people believed in disembodied souls, and most Jewish people believed in a resurrection where, quote, God would give his people new bodies when he judged and remade the whole world. To corroborate that last one, Wright points to John chapter 11 and Jesus' conversation in that chapter with Martha during and after Lazarus' death and resurrection. Then Wright contends that Jesus' claims about his own resurrection prior to his death made no sense to his disciples. They had no idea what he was talking about, says Wright, even though they had their own cultural views about the resurrection. Indeed, the crucifixion meant the end of all their hopes for social transformation, because crucifixion, an emblem of Roman torture, symbolizes the Roman occupation in a final and brutal way. Thus 3b, Wright claims that the Christian hope of resurrection beginning with Jesus changed the standard Jewish hope and resurrection in 7 small but significant ways. First, all of the early Christians believed in essentially the same things about resurrection. Second, resurrection is a central facet of early Christian thought, whereas it exists somewhere on the periphery of Judaism. Third, Wright clarifies that early Christians believed in a resurrected human body that would be transformed into a new state. Fourth, there are 2 resurrections, Jesus and everybody else's. Fifth, believers are to be co-workers of a sort with God in the power of the Spirit, anticipating the ultimate resurrection. Sixth, resurrection has expanded from a view including only Jewish folks to a view that includes everybody of every ethnic group. And seventh, resurrection changed the way that Jewish folks thought about the Messiah. After all those subpoints, after Wright surveys the historical setting of early Christian hope, fourth, he asks exactly what it was that happened at Easter. Wright states, rather anticlimactically, that something remarkable happened, so remarkable that the first witnesses were bewildered into telling different stories about it. Tell us something that we don't know, Dr. Wright. Wright says only 4 important things in this chapter, which is probably twice as long as it needs to be. Wright contends, perhaps arguing with folks that he alone can see, that the gospel stories of resurrection go back to early oral tradition. Second, he notes that Jesus' body is weirdly transformed in the resurrection. He states, it is clearly physical, but equally it comes and goes through locked doors, it is not always recognized, and in the end it disappears into heaven. No biblical texts predict that the resurrection will involve this kind of body. So, from the way that Wright reads the evidence, Jesus' resurrection is entirely new and transformative. So far, I agree with Dr. Wright, and I hope many of you do as well. He'll make a lot more of that point much later in his book. Third subpoint for chapter 4. For Wright, Jesus' resurrection indicates the breaking in of God's kingdom in the exact sort of terms that Karl Barth is using if we go back to his text in Module 3 concerning God the Father. Wright asserts bluntly that Jesus' resurrection isn't about life after death or journeying to heaven when we die. It's about the inbreaking of God's kingdom, and I have to agree there. In our prior modules, Cohn, Bloch, Quoke, and Tinker have all given us good ideas as to what the kingdom looks like from their own perspectives. I note Tinker's there with the Lakota circle emblem. And I kind of wish that Wright also echoed their concerns about justice, but one can't have everything. Fourth and finally, for this chapter, Wright attempts, albeit kind of circuitously, to describe a different kind of epistemology, different mode of knowledge. He calls it by different names, but I'll call it an epistemology of love, his last name for it. This new mode of knowledge, coming to us from Jesus' resurrection, is both bigger than and contains historical and scientific knowledge. This new way of being and knowing involves whole person engagement and involvement. Wright clarifies that love, quote, is the deepest mode of knowing because it is love that, while completely engaging with reality other than itself, affirms and celebrates that other than self reality, end quote. This is the kind of faith that we've interpreted and discerned throughout this course. An engagement that draws out the best in the person doing the loving, the knowing, etc. This is the kind of knowledge that God wants from us. Let's take a breath and recap. Let's step back. Our module thesis follows. Wright seeks to address significant confusion concerning Jesus' resurrection and ascension. To clarify this thesis, you have done 4 things. You've addressed Wright's appraisal of the confusion about life after death in the public realm. You've reviewed his clarification of Christian or churchly confusion on that same topic. You've placed parts of the early Christian hope of resurrection in a historical setting, and you've discerned a part of what happened to Jesus on that Easter morning when he was raised. And you ended up affirming what Wright calls an epistemology of love at the end of that chapter in particular. That's good enough for now. When you're ready, please go on to the next video. Thank you.